do the work for us behind the scenes every day. It truly takes a village.
All right, and that one, we'll get started. We'll go to Ethan Liu.
Amber, with the status of labor talks with so many free agents, with an expansion draft, do you have any idea what this offseason might even...
There is a moment in every sport when everything quietly changes. No press release, no warnings, just a shift so big that the old rules stop applying. For the WNBA, that moment is happening right now, and it's centered around the Indiana Fever. While most fans are still arguing about box scores, rookie stats, and highlight clips, something far more ruthless is unfolding behind closed doors. The Fever have stopped playing the long game, they've abandoned patience, they've ditched development timelines. And they've made one thing crystal clear. This franchise is no longer building a team. They are building an empire around Caitlin Clark. Coaches are gone, systems are being rewritten, money is flooding in at a level the league has never seen before. And with the confirmation of a sneaker deal that reportedly dwarfs the combined salaries of most WNBA rosters, the power dynamics of women's basketball have officially shifted. This isn't just a star player getting attention. This is a front office choosing domination over harmony. This is ownership choosing leverage over loyalty. This is a league being forced to adapt in real time. And the scariest part, they're just getting started. Because once you understand why the Fever fired a playoff coach, why they paid a premium for a very specific replacement, and why Clark now holds more financial power than the league itself, you'll realize this story isn't about basketball anymore. It's about control. It's about money. And it's about what happens when one player becomes too valuable to treat like everyone else. And that's where things start to get uncomfortable. On paper, this move made no sense. The Indiana Fever had just done what struggling franchises are supposed to celebrate. They clawed their way out of the lottery. They survived a brutal early schedule. They stabilized, and they made the playoffs for the first time in years under Christie's sides. In almost any other era of the WNBA, that earns a coach time, patience, maybe even an extension. Instead, she was gone. And that's how you know something fundamental changed. This wasn't a punishment for failure, it was a rejection of good enough. The Fever front office looked at the season and didn't see progress, they saw limitations. They saw stagnant half-court sets. They saw a system that slowed the pace. They saw Caitlin Clark doing historic things while still operating with one hand tied behind her back. That's when the calculations shifted. Because once you have a player who bends defenses the moment she crosses half-court, development timelines stop mattering. The question is, are we improving? The question becomes, are we maximizing the asset? And the answer, internally, was no. This is the part fans don't always like hearing, but front offices understand it coldly. When you possess something rare, you don't protect feelings, you remove obstacles. The Fever didn't fire sides because she failed to win. They fired her because her system didn't fully unleash Clark's chaos. That's a massive statement to the rest of the league. It says playoff appearances are no longer the goal. It says experimentation is over. It says the grace period is done. This was Indiana announcing that the Caitlin Clark era comes with different standards. Faster standards, sharper standards, ruthless standards. And it also sent a message internally. No role is safe if it doesn't align with the vision. Not coaches, not rotations, not roster spots. The organization chose acceleration over comfort, knowing full well it would bring scrutiny and backlash. Because once you fire a playoff coach, you're no longer pretending. You're declaring intent. And that intent became impossible to miss once the Fever revealed who they were willing to pay, and what kind of basketball they were about to force the rest of the WNBA to deal with next. The firing alone was shocking. The hire that followed made it impossible to ignore what Indiana was doing. Bringing in Stephanie White wasn't a safe move, it wasn't a development hire, and it definitely wasn't about continuity. It was a declaration that the Fever are done asking their star to adjust. They're adjusting everything around her. White isn't just another respected coach. She's WNBA royalty, an Indiana native, and someone with a proven track record of building high-speed, high-pressure offenses that overwhelm defenses. More importantly, she's a coach with the authority to demand buy-in immediately. And Indiana paid a premium to get her. Reports indicate the Fever had to aggressively lure White away from a successful situation, which tells you this wasn't opportunistic, it was targeted. They didn't want a coach. They wanted this coach because her philosophy aligns perfectly with Caitlin Clark's strengths. That's the shift. In most cases, rookies are told to slow down, read the game, and fit into existing systems. The Fever just flipped that logic on its head. They hired a coach whose system is built on pace, spacing, transition threes, and rapid decision-making, the exact environment where Clark becomes unguardable. This move officially ends the adjustment period. Indiana is no longer treating Clark like a rookie who needs protection. They're treating her like a force multiplier who dictates the geometry of the floor. And when a franchise hires a coach to match one player's chaos, it tells the rest of the roster exactly where the hierarchy sits. This isn't subtle. It's also terrifying for the rest of the league. Defensive coordinators already struggled to contain Clark when she was playing in systems that didn't fully cater to her game. Now, the Fever are committing to an offense that amplifies her gravity on every possession. Faster tempo, more movement, fewer safety valves for defenses to hide behind. And here's the part that matters most. By hiring White, the Fever aren't just betting on basketball fit. They're betting on authority, on experience managing pressure, on someone who can handle the media storm, the resentment, and the scrutiny that comes with building around the most valuable player in the sport. This wasn't a coaching change. It was a power realignment. And once that was locked in, the next piece of the puzzle, the money, pushed everything into a completely different stratosphere. If the coaching changes were the warning shot, the money was the detonation. Because once the details of Caitlin Clark's Nike partnership started circulating, the conversation shifted from basketball to power. Reports claim the deal is worth around $28 million over 8 years, a number so large in WNBA terms that it's hard to even contextualize. This isn't just a sponsorship. It's an economic earthquake. For decades, the WNBA has struggled with salary caps, marketing limitations, and profitability debates. Entire careers have been built on earnings that don't come close to what Clark secured before finishing her rookie season. That's why this deal hit differently. It exposed a gap the league can't ignore anymore. Clark's rookie salary, famously around $76,000, went viral as a symbol of how disconnected pay was from impact. Then Nike stepped in and essentially said, "The market has already decided." And when the market speaks at that volume, everything changes. Because now, the leverage has flipped. Traditionally, teams hold the power. They control contracts, minutes, and futures. But when your point guard is making dozens of times more money off the court than on it, the balance shifts. The organization doesn't just employ her, it depends on her. That kind of financial independence gives a player options that simply didn't exist before in women's basketball. It means freedom. It means patience becomes optional. It means decisions don't have to be made out of fear. And that makes ownership nervous. This is why the Fever's moves suddenly make more sense. When you have a player whose off-court value rivals global superstars, you don't manage them like a normal rookie. You build infrastructure around them. You remove friction. You accelerate timelines. Nike didn't just endorse Clark. They validated her as the face of the sport's next era. They're betting that she's the bridge to a global audience, to younger fans, to a commercial ceiling the WNBA has never touched. And that kind of bet comes with expectations for dominance, visibility, and constant relevance. The Fever understand this. Because once a shoe company commits that hard, you're no longer managing a roster spot. You're managing a billion-dollar narrative. And the most explosive part of that narrative wasn't even the money. It was what came next, the symbol that told the rest of the league exactly where Caitlin Clark now sits in the hierarchy. The money alone would have been enough to rattle the league. But the signature shoe is what truly changed the temperature. In basketball culture, a signature shoe isn't just merchandise, it's status. It's a public declaration of who matters most. In the NBA, that honor is usually reserved for MVPs, champions, or generational icons who have spent years proving themselves. In the WNBA, it's even rarer. Legends like Sheryl Swoopes earned that level of recognition after building entire careers. Modern superstars like Breena Stewart and A'ja Wilson had to wait years before their brands reached that point. The hierarchy was clear. Legacy came first. Then everything got fast-tracked. For a rookie to receive a signature shoe before logging a full professional season didn't just surprise people, it offended them. And not because it wasn't deserved, but because it disrupted an unspoken order the league had lived by for decades. This shoe isn't about performance alone. It's about relevance. It places one player above multi-time champions in terms of cultural pull. It tells sponsors, media partners, and casual fans exactly where the center of gravity now sits. Every time she steps onto the court, she's doing it as a walking billboard, not just for a brand, but for a new era. That's why reports suggest Nike is fast-tracking the release, aiming to capitalize on peak momentum before the next season even tips off. Insiders claim top-tier designers, the same minds behind iconic Jordan releases, are involved. This isn't a side project. It's a flagship launch. And launches like this create tension. Because when one player is elevated this quickly, everyone else feels the shift. Veterans see years of grinding overshadowed. Younger stars see the bar move overnight. Teams realize that attention, not just championships, now dictates value. That's the uncomfortable truth. The shoe doesn't just represent success. It represents hierarchy. It validates the golden child narrative critics push back against. It ensures every defender knows exactly who they're guarding, not just a scorer, but the most marketable asset the league has ever produced. And once that symbol exists, there's no walking it back. Because the moment the league allowed a rookie to skip the line culturally, it acknowledged something it can't undo. The game didn't change because of points or assists. It changed because the market crowned its star, and the rest of the WNBA was forced to adjust. This is where the conversation gets uncomfortable, but necessary. Because when one player's value explodes this fast, it doesn't just change contracts and headlines. It changes emotions, dynamics, behavior on the court. And the WNBA is feeling that pressure everywhere. For years, veterans built this league under conditions that demanded sacrifice. Lower pay, commercial flights, limited exposure. They earned respect the hard way. Then Caitlin Clark arrived and almost overnight became the economic center of gravity for the entire sport. That kind of imbalance messes with people. Not because players don't recognize her talent, they do, but because she represents something bigger than basketball. She represents the wage gap they've lived with for decades, the attention they never received, the endorsements that never came. So the resentment doesn't always show up in words. It shows up in contact. Hard fouls, extra bumps, off-ball hits that just barely cross the line. The kind of physicality that forces referees into impossible decisions and sends a message without ever being written down. This isn't about hate. It's about hierarchy being challenged. When defenders line up against Clark, they aren't just guarding a rookie. They're guarding a corporation, a walking reminder that the league's economics have shifted, and that shift didn't benefit everyone equally. That's why the rookie rules felt harsher this season. That's why whistles stayed silent in moments that would have gone the other way for established stars. The league is still adjusting, and in that adjustment period, the most visible player absorbs the contact. The Fever front office noticed. They saw the hip checks. They saw the celebrations after hard fouls. They saw the unspoken permission defenses felt to test how much Clark could take. And that's when the strategy changed. Indiana stopped thinking purely about spacing and shooting. They started thinking about protection, about deterrence, about making sure the cost of targeting their most valuable asset was higher than the benefit. Because once the league's most marketable player becomes the most targeted, ignoring that reality isn't toughness. It's negligence. This is the dark side of superstardom arriving too fast. The spotlight brings money, but it also paints a bullseye. And until the league fully recalibrates its officiating and culture around this new hierarchy, that Bulls isn't going anywhere. Which is exactly why the Fever's off-season priorities are shifting in a way that has nothing to do with box scores and everything to do with survival. Because the next phase of this plan isn't about highlights. It's about making sure their star can stay on the floor long enough to dominate. Once Indiana accepted the reality of the target on Caitlin Clark's back, the off-season logic changed overnight. This was no longer about fine-tuning a rebuild. It became about asset protection. The Fever front office isn't just scanning for shooters or secondary ball handlers anymore. They're looking for something far less glamorous, players who can absorb contact, set punishing screens, contest space without hesitation, and send a clear message that cheap shots won't go unanswered. In other words, deterrence. Every league with a transcendent star eventually reaches this point. When officials struggle to keep up and opponents test boundaries, teams step in to self-police. Not recklessly, strategically. The goal isn't violence, it's consequence. Indiana learned that lesson the hard way. They watched Clark get bumped off routes, grabbed off the ball, and knocked to the floor with minimal whistle. They saw how often the physical tone escalated when games tightened, and they realized something uncomfortable. Relying on officiating alone wasn't enough. So now roster construction has a different filter. Can you run at pace? Can you defend without fouling? And most importantly, will you stand your ground when things get chippy? That's why certain players feel safe and others don't. Aaliyah Boston fits perfectly into this new vision. She's strong, disciplined, and commands respect in the paint without needing theatrics. She anchors space and punishes teams for overcommitting to Clark. Kelsey Mitchell benefits too. Her speed and off-ball movement thrive when defenses are forced to pick their poison. Protect Clark and Mitchell burns you. Ignore her and Clark does. Beyond that, nobody is guaranteed anything. The friends and family atmosphere that helped Indiana survive lean years is gone. This is now a cold evaluation phase. If you slow the pace, stop the ball, or shy away from contact, you're a liability, and liabilities don't last long when the championship window opens early. That's the harsh truth of building around a superstar. The Fever aren't being cruel, they're being realistic. Every possession Clark is on the floor, she's generating value for the team, the league, and the sport itself. Protecting that value isn't optional. It's mandatory. And while fans might focus on who's added or removed, the real shift is philosophical. Indiana has accepted that with superstardom comes responsibility, not just to score, but to shield. Because the next phase of this era won't be decided by talent alone. It'll be decided by whether the Fever can keep their star upright long enough to let everything else fall into place. Just when it felt like the Fever had tightened control over the situation, a new variable entered the equation. And it didn't come from inside the WNBA. There's been growing buzz around Unrivaled, the upcoming 3v3 league founded by Breena Stewart and Nafisa Collier. On paper, it's designed to solve real problems: better pay, shorter commitments, and an off-season option that keeps talent in the US instead of overseas. But when Caitlin Clark's name entered the conversation, everything changed. Rumors suggest Unrivaled is aggressively pursuing Clark, viewing her as the face that could instantly legitimize the league. Reports claim potential offers could reach 7 figures for just a few weeks of play, possibly including equity or long-term incentives. None of this has been officially confirmed, but the smoke is loud enough to make Indiana nervous. And for good reason. From the Fever's perspective, this is a nightmare scenario. Do you tell the most valuable player in women's basketball that she can't earn a massive payday in the off-season because you're worried about injury risk? Or do you greenlight it and accept that one awkward landing could derail an entire season before it even starts? There's no clean answer. Blocking the move could create resentment. Clark doesn't need the money, but autonomy matters when you've already shifted the power dynamic. Letting her play, on the other hand, exposes the franchise to a risk they can't insure against. And that's what makes this situation unprecedented. Clark's financial independence means she isn't boxed into traditional constraints. She's not choosing between rent and rest. She's choosing between opportunity and workload. That's a luxury very few players in league history have ever had. So far, her camp has stayed quiet. Strategically quiet. That silence keeps leverage high. It keeps her name circulating. It forces both leagues to wait. And it adds another layer of pressure on the Fever's front office, who now have to manage not just a roster, but a relationship with a player who has options everywhere. There's also the physical question no one wants to answer directly. Can her body handle a college season, a full WNBA rookie year as the focal point of every defense, and then a high-intensity 3v3 league without meaningful rest? That's not speculation, that's physiology. And it's the kind of gamble that could define this entire era. Because for the first time, Indiana isn't just competing against other teams. They're competing against opportunity itself. And how they handle this moment will reveal just how much control they actually have. What's happening in Indiana doesn't stop with one franchise. It's spilling into the entire league. Because while the Fever are restructuring their roster and protecting their star, the WNBA itself is being forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. The old economic model no longer works. And Caitlin Clark is the catalyst. Not long after her arrival, the Players Association made a move that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago, opting out of the collective bargaining agreement 2 years early. That decision didn't come out of nowhere. It came from numbers, ratings, ticket sales, merchandise demand. Clark didn't just bring attention. She brought leverage. Suddenly, national broadcasts were being built around one player. Arenas were selling out weeks in advance. Road games felt like home games because fans were following her, not the logo on the jersey. Sponsors who had ignored the league for decades were calling non-stop. The pie got bigger fast. And once that happens, everyone starts asking the same question. Why are we still splitting it the old way? That's the paradox Clark created. On one hand, she's the reason future players will get paid more. On the other, she's a constant reminder of how uneven the rewards still are. Veterans know the revenue jump doesn't happen without her, but they also know she's the one benefiting most immediately. Gratitude and resentment coexist. That tension is now baked into the league's future negotiations. Owners can no longer argue poverty when one player alone is generating this level of value. Players can point to real numbers, not hypotheticals, and the league office is stuck trying to modernize an infrastructure that was never built for this kind of star power. This is why Clark's presence feels disruptive, even when she's doing nothing controversial. She exposes inefficiencies. She accelerates timelines. She forces conversations people weren't ready to have. Every rookie coming up now will be measured against her deals. Every nil prospect will expect more. Every negotiation will reference the Clark effect, whether owners like it or not. And that makes her more than a player. She's a benchmark. But benchmarks are dangerous. They raise expectations instantly, and not everyone can meet them. That's why pressure around Clark keeps growing, not just to perform, but to justify the revolution she unintentionally started. Because if the league is going to restructure itself around this moment, it needs proof that the moment wasn't a fluke. And that brings everything back to Indiana. All the money, all the moves, all the noise. At some point, it has to turn into wins. And that's where the real pressure begins. Once the money, the power, and the leverage shifted, there was only one thing left to change. The narrative. The media didn't slowly pivot toward Caitlin Clark. It snapped. Overnight, coverage across ESPN, digital platforms, and social media began orbiting almost entirely around her. Fever games weren't just games anymore, they were events. Every shot, every turnover, every facial expression was clipped, debated, and magnified. That kind of attention is exhausting for a franchise. And it's brutal for a player. What makes it worse is how quickly admiration turned into polarization. In college, Clark was the undisputed hero. In the pros, she became a lightning rod. Not because her play changed, but because her visibility did. When one player dominates airtime, resentment isn't far behind. The Fever organization saw this coming. Instead of trying to soften it, they leaned into it. By firing a playoff coach, hiring a no-nonsense replacement, confirming massive endorsement deals, and reshaping the roster around one star, Indiana stopped pretending they wanted to be liked. They embraced the role of the super team villain, the franchise with the money, the attention, and the audacity to act like it. That's a dangerous position. Because villains don't get the benefit of the doubt, every loss becomes a referendum. Every cold shooting night becomes a crisis. Every whistle, or lack of one, turns into a conspiracy theory. And Clark absorbs all of it. She's not just playing defenses anymore. She's playing expectations. She's playing narratives. She's playing an algorithm that thrives on outrage and debate. This is where Stephanie White becomes critical. Coaching this team isn't just about X's and O's. It's about insulation, about creating routines that block out noise, about knowing when to shield your star and when to let her take ownership of the moment. White has been here before. She understands how quickly attention can turn toxic. She understands that when a league crowns a face, it also sharpens the knives. And she understands that the best response isn't defensiveness, it's control. That's why the Fever aren't backing down. They're not apologizing for the deals. They're not deflecting the spotlight. They're not spreading attention evenly to make things feel fair. They're committing. Because once you're this far in, hesitation is weakness. And if Indiana is going to be the most watched, most scrutinized, and most resented team in the league, they've decided they might as well be the most dangerous too. Which leads to the final reality nobody can escape. Attention buys opportunity, but only winning buys peace. This is where everything converges. The coaching chain, the Nike deal, the roster shift, the media polarization. None of it exists in isolation. The Indiana Fever didn't accidentally stumble into this storm. They looked at the attention, the resentment, the leverage, and the pressure, and chose not to flinch. They didn't try to dilute the spotlight. They didn't pretend balance was still the goal. They accepted the reality. Because once Caitlin Clark became the economic engine of the league, neutrality was no longer an option. You either build fully around that gravity, or you get crushed by it. Indiana chose to build. That decision comes with consequences, every loss will be louder, every slump will be magnified, every hard foul will become a debate, every roster move will be treated like a referendum on the future of women's basketball itself. That's the cost of being first. Clark didn't ask to become the symbol of a labor shift, a sneaker revolution, and a cultural divide. But once the market crowned her, the league had to respond, and the Fever responded more aggressively than anyone expected. They fired comfort. They hired authority. They prioritized protection. And they aligned their entire operation around one truth: this window is open now. That doesn't guarantee championships, nothing does. But it guarantees clarity. And clarity is something the WNBA has rarely had when dealing with superstardom at this scale. The uncomfortable part is that winning may not even be enough. Clark will still be criticized. The Fever will still be resented. The spotlight won't dim just because they execute well. In some ways, success will only sharpen the divide. But that's the trade-off Indiana accepted. They're no longer trying to be liked. They're trying to be inevitable. Because history doesn't remember who made people comfortable. It remembers who forced change, even when the league wasn't ready. The Fever didn't break the system. They exposed it. And now the rest of the WNBA has no choice but to decide how it wants to exist in the Caitlin Clark era, resisting it, resenting it, or adapting fast enough to survive it. Because whether anyone likes it or not, this isn't a phase anymore. It's the new center of gravity, and the league is already orbiting it.